So thank you all for coming. My name is Matt Jones, and I am our head of enterprise architecture at Fitch Group. And you may have heard of some of our companies within Fitch Group, particularly Fitch Ratings. Fitch Ratings is a company that provides credit ratings for companies and countries around the world. It takes a lot of data to produce a credit rating, which is valuable to many of your companies, and so we actually sell a lot of that data through a lot of our Fitch Solutions companies that you'll see on the screen. And Fitch is wholly owned by the Hearst Corporation. And I mentioned this to give you just a little bit of context on how my team works and where my team works. We are at the Fitch Group level supporting all of these companies below us in the hierarchy. And it's a really great place to be. Fitch and Hearst both provide the stability of companies that are more than 100 years old. And yet our tech and data teams are small and nimble, and I think you'll get a taste that we're trying to operate a little bit more like a startup culture, and I think it's working. But in the beginning of 2021, we didn't have an enterprise architecture function. It was brand new, and starting an enterprise architecture function isn't a paint-by-numbers exercise where you fill in all the bubbles and you have a complete work of art, right? It was a complete blank slate. And though, of course, we had some high-level goals, like enterprise governance, that was a given, we had to figure out what tools we needed in order to deliver and in order to support the organization in this new capacity. We brought together a group of experts from around the firm who had been working as kind of de facto architects in their own areas, and we said, build an enterprise architecture function. Now, most of us had had some DDD exposure at some point, and so we knew this needed to be a part of the solution. Before we introduced the Architecture Review Board, we had minimal governance over our architecture designs. Each team's designs were snowflakes, which might have been similar to their last design, but probably not that close to any standards in the enterprise. As a result, our operations teams needed to learn lots of new designs, and it was a real challenge to move engineers between teams because they generally had to learn a whole new stack. We also didn't have a technology roadmap that led to a little bit of a Wild West. And so we started with the ARB and the tech roadmap as the core of our architecture practice. As a result of this, we're able to provide the business with justification on the modernization efforts that we're driving, which is showing results as more and more of our teams are engaging in these modernization efforts. But a governance-centric approach was not enough. One thing that really stood out to us was how new projects were getting started. So here's a story I'm sure some of you have seen in some of your organizations. I know I've seen it in basically every company I've worked at in my whole career. Somebody comes up with a great idea, and they talk to you and they say, let's have a meeting. And so we have a meeting and it's 30 minutes long. And this sounds like indeed it's going to be a really great idea, right? And at the end of it, we say, that's great, but I think we really need to bring Joe into this conversation. And so the next week, there's another meeting, and Joe's there, and we rehash most of what we talked about last week and maybe cover a little bit of new ground. And then Joe says, I think we need Nancy. And this goes on for a while, and eventually the business sponsor gets a little frustrated because they just want to know what the plan is for how to make this happen, right? And so they bring in consultants. And the consultants say, before we give you a quote on this, we need you to take all of your most highly paid people who know anything about this and spend 2 or 3 days with us, and we're going to do a workshop, and you're going to give us all the information we need in order to give you a quote. And I've been in plenty of these workshops in lots of different companies, and they're super collaborative, a ton of fun, and it's also no surprise why the consultants end up getting some of the coolest work that there is. And I've seen this way too many times in my career at companies both large and small. And so as we started our architecture practice, and we were discerning what the right problems to solve were, we thought, why don't we try doing these workshops? And so with that context, we set out to change the way that products and projects began. What if we could rapidly understand the business context of a proposed solution? What would happen if our engineers could understand the why behind our projects better? And so, as you can guess from the title of the talk, we've incorporated a few different types of workshops into our way of working. In this talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of each of them, how we decide which ones to use, and discuss the benefits we've seen at Fitch. At the core of each of these workshops is all of these workshops are tools that help us better understand our customers. So the first workshop we introduced was one that we learned from our partners at Amazon. Everyone I've talked to from Amazon talks about how much this is a part of their culture, and it's been key to their success over the years. I've never worked there, so you'll have to find somebody who works there if you want to know all the details on the inside there. But this book by Colin Breyer and Bill Carr was published in 2021, and it goes into a lot more depth than I can cover today. Today, I'm going to focus a bit on how we experience this at Fitch and how we've used this. I'm going to give you an overview of all three of the workshops, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one because I think it's the newest one for this audience. So, in this workshop, ultimately what we're creating is a press release. And it's a press release for the project that we're brainstorming about. So we're envisioning what is everyone going to say about this project when it's all done. And we're building this collaboratively through a number of exercises that I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. And this probably doesn't look like any deliverable you've ever seen from an architect, and that's okay. Think of this like a unit test for the architecture. If I'm designing a solution, I need to know that it's going to have impact, and I need to understand the challenges I'm trying to solve. The press release is the deliverable at the end, but the collaboration in the workshop to get everyone to agree on what's important, and more importantly, what's not important, is where the magic is at. It's a pretty unique approach to kicking off a project, and I'm going to share a bit about how we get into this. Now, a lot of what I'm about to present to you might seem like our architects or product managers. We're not. But we do approach this from an architecture perspective. But our friends in product are key partners in this. What we are trying to do, though, is get a solid understanding of the challenges that we're trying to design solutions for. Working backwards is, for us, a tool that allows us to ensure that we're solving the right problem in the architectures that we're preparing. So there's a lot to love about working at Fitch, but one of my favorites is this data science challenge that we run every year. It's a grassroots event organized by a bunch of people who just have an interest in data science, and we invite anyone in the company to join a team and compete on various challenges. In 2021, through a really great partnership with Amazon, we brought in a trainer from AWS to spend a few hours with our teams to train them on this working backwards approach. And that year, the outcomes from this challenge were so much better than we had ever seen before. And it was because the engineers and the data scientists on the teams weren't just solving an interesting challenge, they understood the business context of why these particular things were challenging to the business. We started to think there's something here, but it was a little bit hard to get momentum after this. So the next year we had a big project and we were looking for a partner to help us deliver it. And this time we did intentionally go out and choose AWS Professional Services to work with us. And like every other consulting firm, they said, we want you to allocate 2 days of time with about 20 people who know anything about this and tell us everything that you want. But they said they were going to do this workshop using this approach called Working Backwards. Of course we did, and the experience was so great, we bought the book and started really rolling this out internally. Now, a lot of the slides I'm going to show come from the decks I use when I'm facilitating these workshops at Fitch. One of the initial challenges we faced was that people were used to meetings where somebody's coming in and reporting the decisions that have happened. I like to set the expectation up front that this is a collaborative experience, and we're here to gain clarity on the needs of the customer so that we can design the right solution. I'm often asked what people should do to prepare for these workshops, and I tell them it would be a good idea to understand and think a little bit about what the customer pain points are, but I am intentional about not showing the participants what all the activities in the workshops are going to be. Because it's important that we encounter these together, collaboratively in the workshop. So before I get into the workshop, the first thing I do is I work with the sponsor, who's usually a product owner or a product strategist or something, to understand which personas we're going to be working with in the workshop. In one that we did recently on publishing ESG content within our Sustainable Fitch team, we chose ESG customer, ESG analyst, and ESG editor. Now, when I'm doing these workshops, 3 is a magical number. I don't let anybody choose more than 3 personas for this, because if I have more than 3, it's way too much cognitive overload. And so sometimes we have to force fit things a little bit. In this particular case, we were working on the system that the analysts and the editors use to publish content. And so it was fine for us to generalize all of the personas in the ESG customer category into one just called ESG customer. Obviously, if we were working on our website that was supporting the ESG customers, we'd have a lot more personas related to them. It is important to have this part figured out before the workshop, though, because this impacts who you invite to the workshop. I always ask the sponsor to bring at least one representative from each persona into the workshop. And again, this list of who we invite to the workshops is applicable to both Working Backwards or event storming. I want people in these workshops who have the jobs that we're talking about, so that we can ask them questions and get answers right now. Most of the roles here are pretty self-explanatory, but the other specialists as needed is worth emphasizing just a little bit. Always save some room for people who have some special knowledge. For the workshop I was doing last week on how we permission clients access to our research, I invited our application security experts because I need them to understand that process really deeply. And when putting this attendee list together in a large company, it's really easy for this to get out of control. But my other magic number on this is 20. We're going to limit the whole number of participants to 20. More than 20 and facilitating gets to be a real challenge. I've done this with as many as 30, but don't start there. That's not the place to start. It's also important to note that most of my own commentary on this is like when I get involved in these projects, it's usually where there's several different squads that are trying to collaborate and build a solution. You might not need this many roles or this many people if you're working backwards on a single squad project that's going to be done in 3 sprints. You could probably bang through these activities a lot quicker if you wanted to use this tool in the smaller settings. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of each of these activities, but after the intro, the basic format is I introduce an activity to the large group, so all 20 people, and then if it's an online meeting, I'll open breakout rooms for each of the personas and give them 15 minutes or so to complete an activity, setting the timer on Miro or FigJam or whatever we're using, so that everyone knows how much time they have left. And at the end of that 15 minutes, I'll bring everybody back to the large room, and we'll spend about 15 minutes, and I'll ask somebody from each of the breakout rooms to read through what their outputs were. And there's a little discussion. And this is really important because usually people don't fit cleanly into one of the personas, especially the engineers in the room. So if my engineer is in the ESG analyst breakout room, he might have something to contribute for the ESG customer group, and we'll use that time as the large group to do some of that cross-pollination across teams. And then I introduce the next activity and we go into the breakout rooms again. But we're doing that with the knowledge that we gained in the prior activity. And that part's really important. Lots of people want to know exactly what time they should come to this workshop. And I generally just reply by asking them to clear their calendar so they can give their full attention to the day. This also allows me to be a little bit more flexible and fluid with the timings and the schedules, because sometimes a team needs an extra 10 minutes on one of the activities so that they can make more progress on the next step. So when we do working backwards, it really boils down to these 5 questions. Who is the persona? What is the persona's problem or opportunity? What is the most important persona benefit? How do you know what the persona needs or wants? And what does the persona experience look like? And in some projects, some products that we work on, it might only take us 5 minutes to answer these questions. And in others, it might take 5 months to get a more complete picture of what the answers are. And that's okay. In these workshops, we're doing these in a pretty accelerated pace to get a shared understanding, but I do clearly acknowledge that more targeted follow-up may be necessary. Now, I've seen a lot of software systems built in my career, and usually somebody comes to an architect and says, I need an application that allows me to do X, Y, and Z. And they often say, and we want to build it with this tool that the business has selected. When that happens, the discussion usually devolves into a pure governance debate along the lines of, well, why can't I install the organization's 17th content management system? We tend to skip the why and get straight to debating the what. For us, working backwards is a tool that enables us to discuss the why, and then we can have an honest discussion about the approach in the context of the user's challenge. One quick example, in the context of one of the data collection workshops, we discovered that one of the pain points that they had was managing workflow outside of the system. And this was a real pain point for them that wasn't on the base set of requirements that we were given. Now, at this point in my intro, I'll tell the participants that I'm a scoutmaster, and once an 11-year-old earns the right to carry a knife, they want the biggest knife with all the features. But it's never that usable. It doesn't fit in their hands. It's too big. It's hard to get the tools out. Doesn't have good safety features. The scouts are falling for the wouldn't it be cool if trap, right? And when we're building software systems, it's too easy for us to fall into the same trap. So I ask those who are attending these workshops to try to avoid this phrase, wouldn't it be cool if? Coolness is a trap that leads toward a solution that's never going to be built. We're here to understand what our customer needs, not what we think would be cool for the customer. Which brings us to our first activity, defining our persona. It's important to know who we are solving the problem for. Marketing or editor or customer are too vague. We need to know a bit more about the role, what they do, what their pain points are in order to solve the problem. And again, each of these are 15-minute activities. And if I'm doing these virtually, I'll have separate boards in Miro or FigJam for each of the personas to help them kind of have their own space to keep it organized. This particular example came from a series of workshops we did with a nonprofit organization in Chicago who we partnered with for our annual Codathon last year, which is separate from our data science challenge. And in many respects, a lot of these exercises are like Mad Libs. As a facilitator, I'm providing the framework that efficiently helps the team to collaboratively self-discover, and the participants are filling in the critical details. Our nonprofit needed a new website, so Daniel Donor had to navigate a bunch of pages on the website when he just wanted to donate. What we're doing here, though, is building empathy with the customer and starting to understand who the customer is, what their job is, and what their pain points are. That empathy is important because it informs the designs that we're going to be putting together. So then we'll start hypothesizing solutions with some value stories. And these come in a few different varieties, the if I knew or if I could variety. So I'm going to give a few examples here. If I knew about new publications from issuers, I'd be able to plan my workflow better, resulting in greater efficiency and workload planning. And we spent some time, and this is also right after we just spent some time thinking about what the customer's pain points are. And we want to be able to connect our actions here to the problem statements of the customer. So ideally, the Z in the slide maps to the need that the customer expressed in the prior activity. As an architect, this tells me that they had a need for a web scraping solution, and in order to improve efficiency. But at this point in the workshop, we're trying to keep the team laser focused on the personas that they're working with and what those personas need. One of the changes we see with this is that the business starts coming up with what their actual pain points are, rather than their ideas for the solutions that might not be the best technical fit for the challenges that they're facing. By focusing on the pain points, architects can leverage the web scraper we already have rather than debating about another solution that somebody heard about from their cousin. And again, we do this with a 15-minute persona breakout room and a 15-minute recap with the large room. And then once we have an idea about our personas and we have some ideas of some things that could help them in their jobs, it's time to think big about how we can address the needs of our personas. I ask everyone in these workshops not to be constrained by the idea that Fitch would never do this. That's all the more reason to put this out there. And I also tell them, don't judge that an idea is too expensive. Let's really think about what we need to solve the actual needs of our persona. It's a problem for another day to find the budget or to figure out how we're going to do it incrementally. Today's challenge is to define an end state that really defines that really delights our personas. And for everyone in this room who's trying to figure out what to do with AI these days, this is a really great activity. One big idea that came up at Fitch recently was, what if we could have a chatbot that a customer could ask a question and it could generate answers from our amazing corpus of research that our analysts have published? We call that Fitch Genie, and we launched that to our customers earlier this month. Another big idea that came out of these workshops was, what if we could give the analysts a single click to open a big financial statement PDF and see exactly where a data point was sourced from, instead of them opening and searching and trying to find the right instance of that number. And this is all working toward this last step where we really work backwards. We've illustrated what the customer pain points are and how our solution is going to help them. And at first, this is really weird because we're not really sure what the solution is going to look like. But we do have a really clear way to test if the design that my team is proposing is good or not, because I can tell if the design solves a customer problem or not. In the workshop, in our breakout rooms, we're actually producing 3 different press releases where different people take different parts of the press release and work on them in the breakout room for about 15 minutes. It's as chaotic as it sounds, but it does help everyone to focus really quickly on what the most important problem to solve is. And at this point, we review it collectively as a large group, and then I give the product managers the homework of synthesizing these into a single press release that we use for the whole project, like the one I showed earlier. So at this point, I'd expect quite a few people in the crowd to be asking, isn't this what product managers do? And I'd say you'd be right. The natural next question is, why are your architects doing this? And why are your engineers participating in all of this? And for that answer, we have to go back a few years to the Agile Manifesto. We all know the 4 main parts of the manifesto at the top, but if you scroll down a little bit, you can click on the 12 principles that underlie it. What I take from these principles is that we need to break down barriers between users and developers. And if we can use an architecture workshop to start breaking down those barriers, that's progress. And I've been in this field long enough to be able to admit that I've built completely the wrong thing a time or two. And every time that's happened, it's because I wasn't able to connect with the users and understand what their needs are. So what happens next? When our architects and the engineers have empathy for the customers that we're building solutions for, they're going to architect and build better products. When we take this journey together, when we're able to have a common, shared, dare I say ubiquitous understanding of the problem we're trying to solve, and because everyone had the opportunity to hear from the users and nothing was filtered, we're able to validate our designs against what we heard. So I ask the engineers and the architects who have spent time building empathy with the users to take no more than 2 weeks to process the most important aspects and turn that into a proposed architecture. And what's really important is it's an architecture that's informed by the customer. It's informed by knowing what's really important to the customer. It's informed by knowing what their pain points are. So before I move into event storming, I wanted to share this quote from one of our product owners. This was from the ESG data collection workshop that I was talking about earlier. By understanding the user challenges, we were able to come up with some really innovative solutions that were out of the box and new that they hadn't really thought of before. But now that we have the press release and the vision, what do we do next? Like working backwards, event storming is another discovery tool that we use when we want to understand a business process from end to end. In this case, this in-person workshop was the very week after we did Working Backwards. This approach gives us an opportunity to dive deep and understand the challenges in the process in order to inform the architecture that will be proposed. Among many great examples, this is probably my favorite. This process is probably the most important thing in our business. It's what's involved to produce a credit rating. And there are, and you can understand why I had to blur things out a little bit for you. It involves about 12 squads supporting about 25 different applications in this process. And there's a ton of people who know 3 to 4 of these stickies really, really well and could add a lot more detail to them. But we were in this workshop, we were just trying to get an overall view of what the end-to-end process was. So in one 3-hour workshop with about 15 participants, we were able to start from a blank slate and map out the process from end to end and brainstorm and prioritize some opportunities to streamline the process. In addition to that, we have this artifact in this Miro board that I actually reference quite regularly. So usually before we get into a workshop, we have some ideas to what the answers to the questions on the slide will be. But the picture isn't really in focus. And everyone in the room might be trying to focus on a different picture. With event storming and other design thinking style workshops, we use collaborative techniques to make sure that everyone is focused on the same picture. Here's an example from a workshop I actually was working on last week. This is a really great example for when we like to use event storming. We recently acquired a company that has research with some complex regulatory requirements around who can see the research that we produce. And we already have another company that has some very similar requirements. And so we mapped out the requirement, we mapped out the current state of each of those processes. And over the course of a couple of, this was a couple of days, a couple of 3-hour sessions, we were able to map out all of the details, and we came up with a decent approach that will allow us to leverage one to help the other, hopefully by the end of the next sprint. And we also came up with a more strategic approach that's going to take a little bit longer, but will provide a more robust solution to both businesses. Doing this as a collaboration between the business and the product people and engineering teams ensured that the questions were answered right away in a collaborative fashion. It was also a great forum for the tech and the business teams to negotiate solutions, with each side better understanding the trade-offs necessary to build the best solution at the right cost. We've used event storming to launch new capabilities. In a separate Sustainable Fitch workshop, we wanted to try a new strategy for delivering content to our marketing and premium websites. And event storming helped us to understand what was needed to launch the new website. We've used it to better understand existing capabilities. This picture on the screen was from an effort we did last year to provide some persona-specific web experiences, and we needed to understand how data was flowing into the existing systems that we were separating. Now, a few slides back, I showed one of the boards showing our ratings process. This process is actually a deep dive into about 3 stickies on that other board. And in this case, we were doing a deep dive on our financial statement processing. When we work at this level of detail, we have a much more comprehensive view on how these financial statements are processed in the company. And while we identified a whole lot of potential improvements, there were at least 2 times during this workshop when the analyst was explaining a challenge and the engineer was able to explain a different way to use the tool that they already had that addressed the specific challenges, the specific productivity concerns. I mention this to emphasize the importance of breaking down barriers. On a macro scale, we came to understand the complexity of this system that had evolved over 12 years, and we were able to propose improvements to the architecture to address both technical concerns that we knew about and the user's pain points that we previously didn't have a whole lot of visibility into. So before I wrap up our experience with event storming, this is a good opportunity to highlight the value of training. We knew since before COVID that we wanted domain-driven design to be a part of our solution, but COVID killed a lot of that momentum. And then in the midst of COVID, we decided we wanted to have a trainer who could help us focus a little bit more on the virtual experience so that we could start leveraging this without having to wait for everybody to be able to come back together. And we found our conference host, Paul Rayner. This proved really valuable for us as we're a globally distributed company. And though we're in the office a good percentage of the days now, we're still globally distributed. And the skills that we've learned have helped us to reduce our carbon footprint, as we don't need to get people on a plane every time we need to collaborate. In addition to taking his training, one of the best things we did was hire him to lead our first series of workshops, so that we could learn by watching an expert facilitate a workshop in our domain. One of the biggest questions we had at the end of the training, though, was, what do we do next? And Paul rightfully put the question back to me and said, you tell me. And when I started doing these workshops on my own, it became really clear that the thing that was missing was a plan on how to execute. And that's where our third session comes in. With both working backwards and event storming, we end up with a lot of ideas. What the business wants is a plan, and we need to help give that to them. For that, I usually bring in our Scrum Masters to lead us in a story mapping workshop. Usually we schedule this as the last afternoon of a 3-day in-person workshop, or as a 2-hour follow-up to any of the other workshops. It's critical that the business get not only the architectural vision, but the plan to execute. For this part, though, we do usually dismiss the business teams because it's our flavor of this is that it's more about helping the teams plan out the work that they're working on. So this past month, I've worked with one of our teams in both London and New York on a data collection event storming. And as we were wrapping up, there was so much excitement after event storming, and also a bit of trepidation about the improvements we had identified in event storming. But we needed to organize this into what the team was actually going to do. By the time we get here, the team has a lot more clarity on what's being asked of them and why it's being asked of them. The engineers and the scrum masters and the product owners are ready to turn this into a plan. But Jira backlogs with fully fleshed out acceptance criteria don't get created overnight. And to be clear, all we're going for is the titles of the things in the Jira backlogs to give the team a foundation that they can use to flesh out all the details later. So generally what I'll do is I'll start by dragging out the highest voted opportunities from either Working Backwards or event storming, and I'll propose those as our first draft epics. We'll spend a little bit of time refining and into what the team is more comfortable in calling an epic. And then we'll prioritize them and then start breaking those down into stories. And here's one from last May, where we worked with this team over 5 mornings doing a whole bunch of different workshops. And after that initial pass, we were ready. After that initial pass, like I showed on the last slide, we were ready to add a bit more detail. So over just a few hours, we were able to take all of the great ideas and inputs from event storming and turn it into a backlog that this team actually spent about 6 months working on and has just finished. And I think this quote from my friend who leads our external engineering chapter really sums up what we're trying to do. For us, architecture is about a lot more than policies and procedures and governance. Most of the time, our architectures are the systems that we're building, but by bringing everyone together, we're trying to architect better outcomes on our projects. The reason why these workshops have helped us so much is that they've helped us to make connections between engineers, architects, product, and the personas that are using our applications. We began this journey with the intention of aligning our teams more closely with the core principles of DDD. And what we found is nothing short of remarkable. Through the practice of working backwards, we've shifted our focus to truly understanding the outcomes we seek to achieve before diving headfirst into architecture or engineering. This has improved the clarity of purpose on all of the projects where we do this. Event storming has given us a tool to take a deep dive into the complex processes in our business, enabling every team member, regardless of their technical background or experience, to engage with and contribute to our shared understanding of the business process. And story mapping has added another layer to our toolkit, providing us with a dynamic technique that allows us to prioritize features, understand dependencies, and keep the user experience at the forefront of our development efforts. Now, one of our engineering team sent me this picture earlier this week showing how they've started to leverage these workshops on their own, which is exactly what I was hoping for. In this first year and a half, we've developed a team of facilitators, evangelists for the workshops, and even a few self-practitioners. My hope is that we get more self-practitioners applying these principles at the level of the code rather than the architecture, and then they'll be up here presenting next year. And with that, I think I've got a few minutes for Q&A if anybody has any questions.